No.
feet.
Okay, you're good. So Nancy, today we were going to talk a little bit about ways that your family managed food, where they got their food from, how they preserved it, and things like that. So if you wanted to speak about that.
Oh, we'll try and see what we can come up with. Well, obviously, as most families, regardless of where you are, you have to eat. And eat we did. My mother did all the cooking. Now, I was the only child, so we didn't have a big family, but my dad, in the summertime particularly, would have hired help. We also did have a hired man at one time who lived in our house, and he was a permanent fixture. So he was there for breakfast, dinner, supper, and the whole 9 yards. But I guess for the most part, the food that we ate, my mother grew, produced, except for things that were obvious at that time. Flour. We didn't process our own flour, but we just looked at a flour bag in the Goschenhoppen textile collection, and I do remember her buying maybe 10-pound bags of flour. That's what this one was. I can't remember specifically. And we had a Hoosier type kitchen cabinet, and we called it a kitchen cabinet. It had a bin where you could put maybe 25, maybe even 50 pounds of flour. And then you would close that. It was on a hinge of some sort, and there was a flour sifter at the bottom, and you just sift the flour out, because you sifted flour for everything.
And why would you sift the flour?
Lumps, vermin, maybe, bugs, and to make it fluffy. And I remember, getting in more modern times, the flour people, which was Pillsbury and General Mills, what is theirs called? I can't think.
Gold Medal.
Gold Medal. We use it today. They brought out, and this was in more recent times, they brought out pre-sifted. I don't even know if that's on the bags anymore.
Why not?
But it was for a time. Then you didn't have to sift. But when I was in high school, and I graduated in 1950, when I was baking at that time, you sifted the flour before you measured it. And now you just spoon it. So, there were the development in technology on the industrial level as well as the home. But we bought flour and sugar and all of those things from my uncle's store, which was right across the porch. We didn't even have to go out in the rain.
That's handy.
And, however, they did keep tabs, so we had to pay for it. This is not in our household, but there was a bin in that store, a wooden bin, as we're seeing in the country store here. You lifted the lid, and in there was maybe 100 pounds of brown sugar. I'd pour it in there. And there were some other things that were stored that way in the store, and I really don't remember what the other things were. There was a scoop, and he'd scoop out and weigh your pound of brown sugar or whatever. And I loved going in there and lifting that lid and taking a crumb. Brown sugar stays in lumps. But as far as other items, my dad had a dairy, so we had milk products. Never used a lot of milk. I never drank milk. I thought I didn't like milk. After I tasted it, I found out I did. My dad would use on his cereal, and my mother in cooking. So occasionally she would send something, and I don't know what, with him to the barn, or she went and got milk. But this I do know. At Christmas time, and I still have the recipe, and we use that recipe for Christmas market cookies. It's a sour cream cookie, not the commercial sour cream we know today. It was heavy cream, sour. And my mother would ask my dad to dip a cup of cream that would be in the morning. I guess he could do that the next morning for the night's milk, because the cream comes to the top, as you know. And he didn't like that too much, because that affected the butterfat content of the cream, but he did it. So that's how we got cream to make special somethings. Never used cream in cooking or anything like that.
Oh, really? So then she would let that cream sour before she used it in the cookies?
I think so. Now, if I had access to that, I would just put a spoonful of vinegar in it, as you can do with heavy cream. I think maybe she did that already to make sure that it did turn properly, because it can spoil also if you're off timing or something.
Yeah.
But that was and we used milk for cereal and cooking. Potato soup takes milk, the way my mother made it. But other things that she bought at the store then were sugar and flour, baking powder and that sort of thing, and an occasional can of peas. We had no freezer in the early days. Well, you made a face, and I know canned peas are on the very bottom of my list. But she did not can peas, I don't think, very often. I do remember when we got a freezer, then she would freeze peas. So I don't think she did can peas. Probably we didn't like them. Oh, and another thing with canning, non-acidic vegetables such as peas and beans, you need a pressure cooker to be safe, and corn. But many people can those items in cold pack, as they called it, and you had to cook them, I think, in the jar for a couple hours, and well, by that time, you know, they weren't very tasty. But I do remember her canning string beans.
So what things did she can?
Tomatoes, peaches, pears, cherries, and those things were easy because they were acidic, the fruit. Occasionally raspberries or something like that if there was plenty. But in the 1950s, or maybe a little before, she got a small freezer.
How big is a small?
Small, it would be the size of your washing machine, and it had a flip-top lid that served as a counter space when it was down, of course. However, if you put anything on there when you wanted something from the freezer, but the ideal part about that, we could keep ice cream. I wasn't so concerned about the peas and the beans. But the other thing that's wonderful canned is frozen is corn. And of course, when the freezers first came out, it was my experience that people wanted to freeze corn on the cob. And my mother tried it, and we didn't like it. It was waterlogged when you thawed it and cooked it then. But and you still can buy frozen corn on the cob, I believe, in the grocery store. I've never.
What would she grow in the garden then?
In the garden, not corn.
No corn.
The corn and mostly corn was grown in what we called the truck patch. Well, that would have been pumpkins, cabbage, anything you wanted a lot, and cabbage for sauerkraut. And the truck patch was in a small field beyond the house, like across the yard. It wasn't out in the boonies or anything, but they could do that with, early on, my dad used horses, then later on he used the tractor to plow. But that was always then kept weeded, hoed with a hoe, handwork. But I do remember him still using the horses to what he called mark out the truck patch. He had a little, I think it was called a hoagie plow or a ho-ho plow, and he'd take the horses down the length, like even longer than the length of this room, and it would cut a furrow, cut a little ditch. And that's where you drop the bean seed. And if it was too deep for something, you took your hoe and put a little ground in it, and you put the seed in, and then you went back and filled it a little from each side.
So why was it called the truck garden?
Truck patch.
Truck patch?
Okay, if you're in the vegetable business and go into market, that is truck farming. Because you had to use a truck, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's still probably a term that's used somewhat today. Now, my dad never did that, but there were a lot of people in the Harleysville area and further east that went into Philadelphia to market, and they were called truck farmers.
Okay.
Even in horse and buggy times, they did that. And they're still doing it. There's still a few, I believe. If you go to Reading Terminal Market, there's a few farmers there.
Yeah, people pay extra money now for that.
Yeah, that was good stuff. That was, I guess they call it organic today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
But they don't know what's put on the fields out here in Montgomery and Berks County.
So the things that were in the truck patch were the larger things, like corn and cabbage.
And cabbage, and of course they grew a lot of cabbage because they made sauerkraut. And I just found a note in my notebooks. See, I interviewed my mother after I got older and got interested in stuff like that. And, she would say, well, we planted a lot of cabbage. And I said, and then she said, we made cabbage in, I'm going to say October or September. And I've always understood you did cabbage late. And what did she say? They wanted to do it that way because that would give them a way to keep the early cabbage, and the late cabbage would keep in storage. And we had a cave on our farm, which was kind of underground temperature, and that's where they put cabbage.
Oh, tell me,
cabbage
was it a man-made cave?
Yes, it was in the ground. You had to go down, I guess they were concrete or stone steps, and it had a ventilator. And I never remember this at our house, but my aunt and uncle lived 6 miles down the road, and later years, after I was an adult, we'd go visit Aunt Mary and Uncle Ambrose, and Mary had to go out in the evenings, like now, when it's warm during the day and going to get cold at night. She had to go out, and especially if it's going to make frost, that it would get too cold, she'd have to go out and close the vent on the cave.
Oh.
But I don't know the exact timing on that. So, even though you had these features, you had to monitor them, and it's something that the lady of the house, or at least somebody, had to keep track of. And you didn't have a television, well, you had a radio, but they knew when there was going to be frost. That you didn't have to have that sort of thing. And if it was going to get too cold, you had to keep that cold from getting in. But you couldn't let too much hot sun. It was...
Well, and if you make one mistake, you...
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the pumpkins, this might be interesting to you. Pumpkins that you want to keep as long as you can, where would you think you'd store them?
In the cave?
No, you stored them under your bed, because that was warm-ish. But the bedrooms weren't heated either. I must add that. Yeah. And I can remember pumpkins being under the bed.
Huh.
And some years later, my family and I went to New England to a museum, and they had pumpkins under the bed. And the guy said, as they often do, why do you think we keep the pumpkins? I said, because that's where you stored them, because it was the proper temperature. That's the temperature the pumpkins like. Well, she was astounded.
So do you think that's an old tradition, or
yes.
do you think that
I think that goes way back, as they always say.
That's good. I like that. Now, did you eat a lot of sauerkraut?
Yes, not a lot. I mean, we did. I'm not sure we had it every week. Maybe close to that. There were just the three of us, but we liked it.
Yeah,
I still like it.
So you had cabbage and pumpkin that you could store and use during the winter. What other vegetables would you eat during the winter?
And you had the sauerkraut, which you processed in a way to keep it.
And some beans, canned beans.
Also dried beans. Did we mention dried beans? Dried string beans. The green beans, my mother cut them in half this way. She finally learned in the later years to French them. She liked that better, but she didn't know that early on. And you'd blanch them, and then she'd take a tablecloth and send me out onto the porch roof, which was flat, and spread the tablecloth out, and then this kettle of blanched, cooled, and drained beans to spread on the tablecloth in the hot sun dried them.
Really?
And the problem there arose when there's a shower came up, as it's wont to do in the summertime. Then I had to scurry out of the bedroom window and gather them up. And there were times we were out in the field and the storms came too fast and the tablecloth got wet and the beans. Well, then you had to make sure you had a dry tablecloth. You put them someplace where they wouldn't ferment overnight. You know, summertime. Yeah. We always had an electric refrigerator in my day. Okay. So I don't know whether, I just don't remember whether she made room for, you know, it was not great quantities, but...
So then how would she prepare those during the winter once they were dried?
You put them to soak in cold water overnight and then boil them. And then put a piece of ham with it if you like that or want that. And my mother also put dried lima beans and cooked those. Yeah, I made a face too. I didn't like that. But she cooked a lot of, and she dried the lima bean, the bean. Uh-huh. And you know, they're big.
So would that be sort of like a stew or a soup, or did you drain it?
Well, if you cook the string beans, the green beans, and she preferred yellow, actually, because they're a little more tender. Okay. But I don't know why she didn't always do that. Well, maybe there's different seasons. I'm not much of a gardener. No, she'd cook them generally with a piece of pork, or ham, because we butchered in the wintertime, so we had ham, and maybe other times a piece of bacon for flavor. And we just eat those as a vegetable.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it wasn't an entree. It was...
No, it was a vegetable. I still like dried string beans. I've made them since, well, I don't now. Matthew doesn't want them, but after I was married, I made them. Huh. Because Abe liked them. He wasn't a Dutchman, but he liked anything with Dutchman.
So... Other than the truck patch, I guess your mother probably did your father manage the truck patch? Was that his?
I think he would help hoe and things like that.
Okay, but your mother did that too.
Right. Okay. He also would help with picking string beans if he had time. But you know, string beans come in at the same time that there was haying to do, and that took precedent.
Yeah. So then you had another garden closer to the house.
New Englanders, I think, and other people called that a kitchen garden. And that was right close to the house. And that was fenced. This other one was not. Okay. So you had critter problems. But, and the small garden was a 4-bed garden. And that was and I didn't know that at the time. That was the traditional Pennsylvania German garden for the household. There were 4 beds. Now, in early days, it had a central bed where there was an Adam and Eve, and some cultures, I think some Catholic families had I can't think, rosemary or something maybe in that central bed. My mother, you know, she didn't bother.
She just had the 4.
She had 4 beds. And one of those had, when I was a girl, a kid, had reverted to asparagus patch where asparagus was planted, and they came up every year. Of course, some of them migrated to other parts of the garden. And the farm. We went out to get asparagus. We'd go all over the place because we knew where they were.
So they sort of gone wild a little bit?
Well, more or less. Uh-huh. You know, there's only, 1 or 2 come out from a root on any particular day. Yeah. So you have to...
So were the squares in the garden mounds, or did they have boards defining them?
Originally they did, and I don't know that, maybe there was some hilling up, but they did use boards to walk on. When you walk with your hoe and cut a trough or I can't think of the word. A furrow? Gully, yeah, to put your seeds in. And my mother always put a board. You're not going to walk on that loose earth because that's going to, pack it down. And if you scrape it into the seeded trough or seeded row, it's going to get too deep and all that. I mean, you walk straight down the garden.
Okay, so I'm confused. So you had 4 beds and then the boards, she'd put the boards down inside the bed. So
Yeah.
the 4 beds were each
you
big.
moved the boards
Okay.
as you went along.
So how big was each of the beds?
The whole, I could go up and measure the garden. It's still there, I think, unless they probably mow it now. They were probably,
Like mine are 4 by 4. Yours were bigger
not
than that.
4 foot.
4 foot by 4 foot. Yeah.
No, they're bigger than that. About the length of this counter, perhaps. Maybe not quite.
Okay. So pretty big.
Maybe not quite. Well, it would depend on the entire garden because that was then all in moldables that fit
Right.
for 4.
Right. So it was a big garden.
It was
and then,
big.
And then they did have planks, but they had planks to define it, but there was no.
They weren't.
mounded.
No.
Now I heard I've heard 2 theories on the mounding. I've heard some people say that it's really important to mound, and other people say that if you mound, it's harder to keep them watered.
Well, I think we never watered except when you put seedlings in, like head lettuce. I can't think of a vegetable, but then we watered, but we never had a hose.
Oh.
If you watered with a bucket and a tin cup.
I can see why you didn't water.
One corner of the garden was on the path. The house stood here, and the garden was below the house, and the path to the barn went past the garden, and it was fenced with boards with like chicken wire on it. Boards probably isn't the proper term. And around the perimeter were narrow beds, maybe 2 foot, and there were some perennials in there, and some of those were flowers. But one place on the way to the barn was the lilac bush. That was there till, I really don't know what the place looks like. We pass it when we go to the auntie's house, but the barn is gone, so it's hard to get oriented.
Yeah.
And
So why was there a lilac?
tradition.
Oh.
And now, like Alan Kaiser, he goes around looking for old properties, and even if the gardens are gone and the house has been remodeled, sometimes you find a lilac bush, and with proper and looking and knowing, and if the ground hasn't been disturbed too much, he'll say, well, that's where the garden was. Lilac bush.
Really? That's fascinating.
I'll try to give you Alan's garden article from the Folk Life.
Oh, that would be great. That'd be great.
I hope I remember.
So would you say that the garden close to the house, was that just a functional, practical garden, or was that sort of a point of pride? Did you try to keep it looking extra nice?
It was practicality.
Mm-hmm.
I think there were people, and just like in sewing or meal preparation, some women are much more fussy in how things look.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was neat, but she was more concerned that this garden produced beans and red beets and things like that.
And, okay, so what were the things that she grew in the kitchen garden then?
Well, red beets, but not for canning. See, that's where the truck patch came in. If you're going to can, then you grew more, and that's where the truck patch filled the bill. Never grew celery.
Yeah, huh.
No. Onions get planted in the spring, as you probably know if you do any gardening. She bought onion sets, which are a tiny little onion to put in the ground. She always had parsley in one of those side beds. Very few herbs. She didn't cook with herbs. Parsley.
Did she do strawberries? Or?
There was a strawberry bed incorporated in like a half of one of those 4 beds. And of course, then occasionally I think they would plant a new bed to perpetuate better berries and more better crop. And then the strawberry bed went.
So they kind of rotate.
There was some rotation.
And lettuce?
Yes, leaf lettuce mostly.
So
and that planted early.
My grandmother was German, not from this area, and she made a salad dressing for leaf lettuce with cream.
Yes.
Did your family ever do that?
Yes.
Like cream and sugar and
yes.
I think vinegar?
Yes.
That's still my favorite dressing.
Yes, and that, while I said we never used cream, she would use evaporated milk.
Oh, okay.
Not nearly as good.
Yeah.
When she got older and, thought about things or heard about things or, then she would buy a little cream once in a while, even after my dad he gave up farming. I don't know. Well, he gave up cattle. He gave up cows, so he didn't have the dairy. So he was just producing things to sell.
So how many cows did they have?
I think up almost 40 at some point in time.
So
Now, they weren't always milking all the time because, cows have to have a calf to milk. So while they're pregnant, I guess they didn't milk, or they have to have calves or they won't milk. But I don't know the scheduling or...
Okay. But so he had to do, what, get up early in the morning and...
Milk. And milk 12 hours apart. If you milk at 5 o'clock in the evening, then you have to milk at 5 o'clock in the morning. And that's why a lot of the newer farmers, I don't know what they do today, they would milk late in the evening, after dinner and stuff like that, so they didn't have to get up so early in the morning. But he got up at 5.
So would your mother have a breakfast waiting for him when he got back?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how he did it. I don't think he even had coffee before he went out to milk, but I had to have my coffee.
And he did that by himself then? Or did the
Yes, yeah. At certain times he had a hired man, and then the war came along, and you couldn't get guys.
Oh,
you couldn't get people like that. He hired an old man from the neighborhood who lived in that house that you go past when you go to the auntie's property, that low house on the right, just below.
The one that's like a cabin? The real old cabin?
Yeah.
Yeah. He hired the man that lived there. That's a really old cabin, isn't it? 1700s?
One of the oldest houses in Montgomery County. Pity. It's falling. Well, it is a pity, but that's the way it is.
We'll have to talk about that another time. You told me once an interesting story about how your family preserved ham. Ham. Did you grow your own? Oh, not grow. Did you raise your own pigs?
We raised our own pigs. Many a time we had little piggies in the kitchen because it was too cold or something. He'd only butcher pigs, never beef. We would go to the butcher shop to get beef to mix in with the sausage. I think they like sausage, pork and beef in sausage. Maybe 2 pigs maximum at any one time. And then he had help come in, friends, and then when my cousins got older, they would help if they weren't in school, or the hired man.
So they'd help with the butchering?
With the butchering. Yeah, they would shoot the pig with a 21, I guess, or something, and then hang it up under the forebay of the barn and let it bleed. Now then there was a hose, I think, then, because if you shipped milk to a milk producer, now my dad shipped to Supplee Willis Jones, that was the company, but that was, not Breyers. There was Burton's, Breyers. I don't know, but it was one of the big ice cream companies, and they also made butter. So once a week, the guy who took the milk to the creamery, and that was, I don't know, I guess he had to go all the way to Philadelphia, I don't know. He would bring a pound of butter home. That was the order. I was deducted from the milk bill, please. But so we had to use a pound of butter a week, and that's sometimes, well, my dad liked butter on his sticky buns, if you can believe that. No wonder he had high cholesterol, right? But he, sometimes it was a little hard to use all that butter, but I know then my mother did bake something with butter. And you didn't know about freezing it. Well, you didn't have a freezer. Yeah, this little thing in the refrigerator. But we did have an electric refrigerator from the time I was alive.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So you'd make your own sausages and cure your own hams?
Yes, clean the guts. My mother cleaned the pig guts, and that's an art.
Oh, to use for the sausage.
To use for the sausage, first, and my dad would empty them, and he'd loop them into, so they were something like this, and then he'd cut the looped area, and then the gut stuff would come out, and he'd rinse them somehow, I don't know, but then my brother, he brought them to the kitchen, and my mother would put that intestine pieces, they were maybe 4 foot long or something like, and run the water from the kitchen sink through it. Then she put them in salt water and cleaned them on a board, like a shingle, and a dull knife, and she would scrape, and there is a lining in that intestine that is removed, and you want to get that. Maybe she did it first with it unturned, I don't remember quite, but there's stuff comes out, kind of a pinkish gook. And you made sure all of that was cleaned out, and then you soaked them in some salt water and used them the next day.
That's time consuming too.
Yeah, and you had to be careful. You cut that thing when you start putting sausage meat in there. Pops right
so
out.
that's the casing.
That's the casing.
So it was a pig
yes,
intestine
they're
casing.
Pig intestines. Yes.
And then did you chop the meat or
ground it?
Ground
Yeah, they had a grinder that ran off of a tractor. The tractor has a power takeoff, and it ran a belt. They could put a belt onto the grinder. Now, in earlier days, they ground this way with your hand, but this was more efficient and maybe a little better. I could never imagine how, because we had a hand grinder in the kitchen that we used to grind up leftover cooked meat to make, well, you'd call them croquettes today. My mother called them meat patties. And that's how we did it.
Okay, and then would you smoke the sausage?
Some, and some my mother canned.
Really?
Which, without a pressure cooker, and there's ways to do it, you cook the sausage in a frying pan. One of the frying pans is up here in the museum.
Really?
A lot of fat, and then you put that in the jar and made sure there was fat on the top. See what that does, that seals it. We ate a lot of that sausage.
It didn't kill you.
Never killed it. We kept it in the cellar, never in the heat, in the dark, in a cupboard, and I have the cupboard that we kept the jars of sausage in.
Really? And so did you have a smokehouse?
Yes. So we smoked some things, smoked some of the sausage, cured the ham and the bacon. That has to be put into a salt brine solution, and that in itself is science. And I don't know how my dad knew. Now today you can get some kind of a measuring device like a thermometer that gives you the saline percentage. Yeah. And they're in that for a while. And sausages are less time than hams, and shoulders are smaller. And bacon, they're all timed differently. And then you hang it in the smokehouse. The fire has to be a certain temperature. He didn't know that, but he knew what it was to look like.
And so how would that be in the smokehouse for hours or days or?
Sausage maybe is like, I don't know, I'm going to say 8 hours. And hams would be maybe a week. Bacon a little less. I don't know. I mean, my dad knew. And I'm sure there are old farmers around that still know.
Yeah.
Maybe even Butcher Miller does.
Yeah, probably. And then how would you store the hams after that?
We had what they called a butcher bench, and that was in the summer kitchen, which we didn't use in the wintertime. They'd lay them out there, and no, you had to do the salt before. You had to salt them. Sometimes they salted in a brine, in a tub. Other times they did it dry, like I was just starting to talk about on a table. You took the ham. Let's see. It's smoked, right? We've got to smoking it.
Yep.
When he put the bottom part of the ham, which is the narrow part, and then butt is the other end. Well, you put string on the shank end so you can hang it up.
Okay.
And you hung that in the smokehouse for the time that we've been talking about. Then, when that's done, they took it out and wrapped it in muslin. They may have also put something on as sort of an insecticide. I don't know what, and I might be completely wrong on that, to keep the bugs off. And first in muslin, and then in brown paper. And I think they sealed the brown paper somehow with glue or what have you, and either hung them in the granary or buried them in the oats bin. Now the oats bin was a big, obviously a bin, maybe, and it was in the second floor of the barn. I think they must have been, it was at least 8-10 feet long and 4 feet wide, and then there were boards that you could put in the front and fill it in with grain, oats, and as we're talking about, to keep it from rolling out. And so that was always at some sort of an angle, and that's where they bury the hams, wrapped in muslin and then paper, brown paper.
And was that for temperature control, or?
That was, I think, part for rodent control, part for, I guess, temperature, because I don't know that it would have frozen in there because you had cattle underneath, and the barn kept warm.
So it kept it just at a good temperature.
Yeah. And, you'd wanted a piece of ham. My dad would bring it up to the table and cut up to the house and put it on the table and cut it off and saw it off. And
then
I just am not sure what they did then, whether they recovered it, they had to, and maybe they just hung it there. It would be cold weather by that time.
Yeah. Okay, one last question. Did you have a special treat that you used to enjoy? Maybe something that your mother or father would...
Me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something that they might make for you or pick for you from the garden.
Okay, I'll tell you, this wasn't anything my dad produced, but I got a ring bologna in my Christmas stocking one time.
Like Lebanon bologna?
No, there's ring bologna today.
Okay.
And they put it in it's like a sausage casing, but they're this big around. You go to any butcher, any store here, even Weiss's or even Giant sells ring bologna.
And was that like something that you were happy to have received?
Oh, yes.
Oh, really?
Yes. I always liked my bologna.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. My dad also